Okay, good morning everyone, and thank you for joining me for today's event, Digital Identity in Government. My name's Claire Cox and I work for the technology consultancy ScottLogic. We build bespoke software solutions for our clients, many of whom are in the public sector and some of whom we're honoured to be joined by today. ScottLogic has recently been awarded a new contract to act as implementation and development partner on the Scottish Government's Digital Identity Programme. So we're delighted to be discussing this topic with this esteemed panel of experts. So joining us today, we have Mike Crockart, Identity Platform Service Owner at the Scottish Government, Cheryl Stevens, Digital Director at the Department for Work and Pensions, and Ash Smith, Deputy Director at GDS. Thank you all for joining us. Today's panel will be facilitated by my colleague Nick Betts, Principal Consultant at ScottLogic. And before I pass you over to Nick, I'll just start with a little bit of housekeeping and a quick apology. Today's event has been advertised as finishing at 2:45, and although the panel will be wrapping up at around 2:45, we'll then take about 10 to 15 minutes of questions from the audience, which will take us up to the hour. If you do need to leave at 2:45, don't worry, as we will email the recording to you later today, and you can still get your questions into the panel as we go along. If you do want to ask a question, pop it into the question box and we'll take as many as we can at the end. So without further ado, let me pass you over to Nick to get us started.
Brilliant, thanks Claire. Okay, firstly, let me set the context for today's panel discussion. So digital identity in government isn't a new concept. Back in 2001, government implemented the Government Gateway, an early web portal to allow citizens to register and access online government services. This was then followed by gov.uk's Verify, a Cabinet Office-led programme in 2011, which launched in 2016 to establish one trusted login across all online services provided by the British government. Over the course of a decade, a variety of other digital identity portals for citizens and businesses have been developed or prototyped, each with their own specific use case and business driver. So it's clear that there's real focus behind digital identity in the UK government at the moment. And I'm sure we'll hear more from that this morning and have a really interesting discussion. So without further ado, I'm really excited to be joined by an esteemed panel of government digital leaders here today. So let's get on with introductions. Cheryl, do you want to start, please?
Great, thanks, Nick. So I'm Cheryl Stevens. I'm a Director in Digital at the Department for Work and Pensions. For any of you that have been around the identity circuit, you will either recognise my name or my face. I am an identity geek. It forms part of my accountability in my directorate, and I'm really excited to be here with Ash and Mike today. I think it'll be a great conversation.
Mike, over to you.
Thanks very much, Nick. I'm Mike Crockart, Service Owner for the Digital Identity Platform for Scottish Government. Been in the civil service now for about 5 years, and just over 3 years of that has been spent on digital identity. So just a newbie in the area, really, but looking forward to chatting about it this morning.
And Ash.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks, Claire. Good morning, everyone. Great to be here this morning. I'm Ash Smith, Deputy Director for Digital Identity in GDS, where I've been for about 18 months or so. A programme that spans Verify, wider advice in this field across government, and also leading on the development of our new One Login for Government system that we'll say a bit more about later. Looking forward to a really rich discussion this morning, and also pleased that it's happening before the big England-Scotland match on Friday, which means that Mike and I haven't fallen out yet.
Good point. Yeah, brilliant. Okay, well, let's launch into the discussion. Cheryl, if I can just start with you. So as we know, the pandemic has put lots of organisations, but not least DWP operations, under immense pressure due to a huge increase in unemployment, resulting in a surge in benefit claims such as universal credit. In this digital age, many claimants prefer the ability to self-serve online for public services. So having a digital identity to those services becomes critical. Can you talk us through the history of digital identity at DWP and the approach that you're taking to digital identity with the new Dynamic Trust Hub, and specifically the impact of the pandemic on your approach, please?
Yeah, of course, Nick. So I'll start by saying that the last 6 years and more have been a huge learning curve for all public services for digital identity. So anything I say in this panel is not a criticism of anything that's gone before. I think I just want to get that elephant in the room, out of the room in the first sentence. I think where we were as public services, most of our services were analogue and not digital. And in the beginning, there was a real almost misconception that those same analogue identity solutions could be almost translated into a digital world. And of course, we know that isn't true, but it took a great while to get that misconception quashed across lots of government departments, not just DWP. We've got over 20 million customers, many of whom are complex needs, some of whom don't have what we would call traditional identity documents, although if any of my colleagues from the Home Office and DVLA are listening to the panel, they will say they were never meant to be identity documents. They were about travel and driving rather than proving who you were. DWP's journey into digital identity started with gov.uk Verify. We are the largest department that uses gov.uk Verify. It's well documented that it hasn't been perfect for us because of that diverse range of customers in the main. As I said at the beginning, we've learned so much from it, but huge swathes of people couldn't use it. So only around 25% of our entire customer base actually were successful. The last few years have seen us take a very different approach in DWP with the support of GDS and some of our other government department friends like HMRC. And it's really centred around inclusivity and proportionality of service. So being less reliant on the customer, doing the heavy lifting and using the tech to do that for us. And that's where the Dynamic Trust Hub comes in, Nick, to answer your question. So how do we get proportionality without a one size fits all? Actually, you need to orchestrate lots of bits of information. That becomes really onerous for services to do and even more onerous for customers to do. And the Dynamic Trust Hub basically is our orchestration engine that enables us to make those decisions in real time. The pandemic didn't change our plans, actually. They accelerated them. I was really proud of the team. I can't not say this. We were due to launch Confirm Your Identity in September, October time, ready for our reduction of reliance on Verify in line with the roadmap. And they accelerated that to April in direct response to the pandemic. So we proved our own plans were robust, I think, but we're able to accelerate them. Working hand in glove with GDS in terms of that balance between Verify and Confirm Your Identity really led us to a place where whilst it was an awful time for everybody in the country, people who needed our services could get access to our services. And that for me was a big win at that time.
Brilliant, thanks, Cheryl. And I mean, you've mentioned working hand in glove with GDS there. If I can just move over to yourself, Ash. So clearly GDS has a pivotal role to play in digital identity across government. Can you provide and give us a potted history of the work GDS have led in this space, including any lessons that can be learned from Verify, and what's next in terms of future identity initiatives, such as the One Login for Government?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Nick. And just to echo what Cheryl said at the outset, we're working extremely closely together with DWP, and have been over the last year and a half through the pandemic and now beyond. So this is all being done in a really collaborative spirit, and there's no. It's a great question, because we're not sort of super defensive about Verify or trying to kind of sort of hide behind it in any sense. So we really do want to learn from it and move forward. But you're right, we have been leading work across government for quite some time to improve the ability for people to prove who they are online as part of accessing public services. That's not just a question of digital identity, of course, and that's a bit of an abstract concept, I think, to a lot of people, which is something we might want to come back to later as well, and how we explain that more clearly. But it's also about being able to find increasingly personalized advice in the first place, of course. And so it's important, I think, to acknowledge the major role played by other bits of GDS, including our gov.uk colleagues, for example. And as you said earlier, it's 10 years or so in the making, sort of where we are today with Verify, and along that journey, it went fully live in 2016, as you mentioned. There's a lot to learn from it. Some would say there's a lot of baggage, and I would say this, wouldn't I? But I think it's been more successful and had a bigger impact than many people give it credit for, really. And just to recap a little bit, sort of well over 8 million users over its lifetime, around about 2.5 million. So about a quarter of the lifetime users of Verify have signed up since the beginning of the pandemic. And that's played a role in us extending Verify a bit further, as some of you will know. It has demonstrated our ability to create and reuse assured identities across government, not perhaps to the degree that we originally hoped, as Cheryl mentioned, but it has nonetheless developed and demonstrated the concept. The GDS team, in part through Verify and working with that program, has led the development of standards, the good practice guides, and their implementation, which are helping to pave the way for future interoperability and ongoing interoperability, and also successfully put privacy and security-centric approaches right at the heart of what we were doing, as well as actually forging some stronger relationships between public and private sector partners and third-party identity providers. So I think in some ways it was a bit ahead of its time, but definitely, as your question suggests, expectations have changed, technology has changed, the picture across government has changed, and there certainly has been some fragmentation, perhaps not quite the word, but fragmentation of authentication identity systems in government over the last few years, driven by the needs to meet, driven by the requirement to meet user needs, as Cheryl was saying. And many of those developments, like the Trust Hub, like renewing your passport these days online, have been very, very successful. But it does still mean that that original vision of Verify hasn't quite materialized, and that users still have to navigate multiple routes and systems. So through our One Login for Government program, we're still working on that title, but that's its working title. We're really sort of trying to rebuild momentum around that original vision. And there is quite a lot of similarity, as you said too, that we've been grappling with this for quite some time, to provide that single access point for people to access all government services. That's a bold ambition to say all, but I really think that is what we should be aiming for, to deliver the sort of transformative benefits that we've been talking about. And to make that as simple to use, as easy to use, users having control over their data, one way of signing in, one account, and to make that as straightforward as it can possibly be, and to make sure it works for those people who are currently not able to use Verify, again, as Cheryl mentioned. And so you will be aware that we have got some funding from the Treasury this current financial year to do some initial work on that new One Login system. And we're aiming to get to piloting the new thing, private beta phase, by the end of the current financial year, which I think shows our ambition and commitment to try and push that forward quickly. There's a lot of learning here. It's a familiar sounding vision, so I think it is a fair question to ask, what is different this time around, and why is it going to be more successful? And I think there are 5 or 6 things I would pull out that have really struck me over the last year and a half. I think a bit difficult to define, but there is something about our approach here, and certainly I and the rest of the team in GDS are totally committed to making this a really collaborative endeavour, and to make sure that other government departments and services requirements are the things that drive what we're doing. This is not something being imposed from the centre. This is something that we are co-designing and co-developing and co-delivering, and the governance around the programme also reflects that. The second major learning point, I think, is that the user experience of Verify has been problematic and challenging, having to navigate to gov.uk, then to a third-party identity provider, then back again, has been far from straightforward, and has made it difficult as you've switched between branding and provider along that journey to retain the trust of the individual in each stage as you go through. So that's something we're clear we need to correct. We've touched on inclusion, and I'm sure we'll come back to it over the course of this session, but we need to make sure that the future system works for people without passports and driving licenses. And it needs to be more flexible too, for Cheryl, for her team, for her services, for universal credit. It needs to be more flexible, and we need to be able to provide more information about the attributes and checks that have gone into assuring somebody's identity, rather than just presenting a yes/no outcome. And I think finally, there's something about expectation and an agile approach to the development of one login. And I think that's part of the baggage that Verify never quite managed to shake off, was the very large numbers and metrics and targets that were set at the outset, before really enough work had been done to determine whether that they were being set at the right level. So this time we're really determined to sort of set those expectations at a realistic level, and to make sure that we're able to develop the program in a properly agile way. So I'll stop there. I'm sure we'll come back to some of those things over the course of the next 40 minutes or so.
Yeah, thanks, Ash. Mike, so Scott Logic are currently working with yourself and the technology team at Scottish Government on the beta phase of the Scottish Government Digital Identity Service. Can you tell us how the Scottish Government is approaching digital identity, how you're putting security and public confidence first, and anything you learned from the early phases of that's helping now to shape the programme going forward through the beta phase?
Yeah, certainly. Thanks, Nick. I think digital identity has a problem. It has a checkered past in the UK, with abortive plans for ID cards and unsuccessful public consultation in Scotland about 7 years ago. So when we started this project, 3.5 years ago, I was clear that it had to be shaped by that history. So the first couple of things that we did was set up an expert group with individuals with strong expertise in privacy, human rights, and data policy to guide us through some of the challenges we knew we would face. And also set up a stakeholder group to have a complete transparency of what we're doing. We are trying very hard to follow the spirit and practice of open government in the way that we work. And hopefully that helps build trust with the public. It's fair to say, though, that we've had a few twists and turns over the course of the project. So we started with a discovery, just looking at public perceptions of trust. You know, who do people trust with their personal data? Are public or private sector better placed to be actors in this space? And this made it clear to us that while there was a place for public sector companies, our scope would be firmly that of a public sector scheme. And we then did an alpha where we integrated one of the Verify identity providers alongside the public sector identity provider we have in Scotland, called My Account. But when Verify's future became uncertain, I suppose we took that as an opportunity as well as a challenge to move more quickly to what we'd established was our ultimate aim of having a system that was more based on individual attributes rather than on the concept of an identity. And we prototyped that last year and are now in the early stages of a beta build that's to be implemented later this year, and that Scott Logic are helping us to form. I think the things that we have learned along the way is that identity is complicated. Every time you think you've just about got a handle on it, you think of something else that perhaps you need to do, whether that's proxies, whether that's delegated access, whether that's the ability to get strong security whilst maintaining inclusivity and accessibility. There are so many different aspects to digital identity that every time you think you're getting some progress, you come up against another barrier, and that's made it quite difficult. I think the thing that we have, the biggest learning that we have is the distinction, that the drawing apart of a sign-in and facts about that sign-in. And I think that Ash, I'm sure, will acknowledge that was perhaps one of the biggest mistakes that Verify made, of doing that identity up front and it being such a big hurdle to get people in the door. And what we have concentrated on, and so the first stage of our beta is we need to come up with a name too, one login for Scotland. And we need to obviously look at interoperability and federalization or convergence in some way on what the GDS team in this space are doing as well. But at least we're all on the same page now. Whereas I think that a year ago, 18 months ago, we were diverging. And Ash said that as well. When it was clear that we weren't going to be able to sign up as a new service into Verify, and we started to go down the route of attributes, having separate authentication credentials, we were very definitely heading in a different direction. And I think that those paths have now begun to converge again, which is good to see, but does give us all sorts of questions that we now need to answer about. What are the other standards that we need around attributes? What are the standards that we need around metadata to ensure that we have proper interoperability between all of the different systems that are being built at the moment, to ensure that they either converge or that they are at the very least interoperable? And we see that as well in the recent stuff that came out from the European Union. And that they are very much on the same page of talking about a European digital identity wallet and a movement away from the concept of identity and much more about attributes about a person, some of which may well be identity attributes, but widening out that concept and widening out the functionality. So everybody's pushing in the right direction, in the same direction, which is great, but there's still a lot of challenges out there.
So thanks, Mike. Cheryl, I think in every question so far, inclusion has been a key theme. A high percentage of DWP customers are classed as vulnerable and simply don't have the ID we take for granted, such as driving license or passport. Can you talk us through how DWP are approaching inclusion within the context of digital identity services, to ensure that the solution doesn't create a digital divide between the haves and the have-nots?
Yeah, great question, Nick. Actually, it's going to build on quite a lot of what Mike's already said there. So if we go back to the beginning and talk about exclusion, so what were the reasons for some of our most vulnerable customers being excluded from the service? We talk about this as a high hurdle, and I think you mentioned the hurdle there, Mike. And it was really about, 5 or 6 years ago, the conversation was very much about, if we know that Mike is who he says he is, we can allow him to do anything in the service at all. So almost the digital identity piece at the beginning of every service, which is where it used to be, was a really high hurdle to negate some of the risk in the service in terms of that security wrapper that Mike talked about. So that was our first learning point, was around actually, do you really need that high hurdle if you are simply logging in to have a look when your next appointment is? Do I really need to know that it's absolutely 100% Mike, or are there other ways that I can check that it's Mike? So really looking at the data we already hold, looking at the way Mike's behaving, and looking at the things Mike is telling us. So we started our proportionality approach, if you will, in two ways. The first one was around what is the customer actually trying to do? You know, if they are not trying to change their bank account, for example, you know, do we really need that really high level of assurance? And we work with GDS to create different levels of assurance. So in old money, level of assurance 1, level of assurance 2, in new money, medium confidence, low confidence. And that was a real game changer for us in DWP in terms of getting some of that proportionality, because immediately that included more people. So if we only needed a low level of confidence because of the action they were trying to take, great, we weren't putting that high hurdle up at the beginning. Then we started to look at, okay, so if we really are serious about proportionality, we need to start looking at why we're making the customer do all the heavy lifting. So for those, and you're right, Nick, it's about 30% of our customers don't have a passport or a driving licence in the working age community. In these times now with the pandemic, the rate of people not renewing the passports is going up. So therefore, even people who did have a passport before will start to fall into that category as we move forward. So we started to look and say, okay, so if they haven't got a passport or a driving licence, what do we know about them? What do we hold as DWP? Most of our customers we've got a relationship with, and it's a long-standing relationship. We know information, they give us information. How can we hide the wiring, so to speak, from the customer and start to look at this? So we started to look at it we need 3 levels of trust. We need trust in the person. So depending on what it is that they're trying to do we trust them to take that action? So if you're trying to change a bank account, we need quite a high level of trust. If you're trying to book an appointment, we probably don't need much trust at all. We need trust in the action. So what is it that you are trying to do? And truthfully, are you telling us the truth? So if Ash came into our service and said, you know, I have 5 children and I earn £20,000 a year, we can check those facts. And immediately that builds some trust in the fact that, you know, Ash has told us some information that we've been able to validate. So even starting from a low level of, oh, do we think it's Ash? Actually, we've built another layer of trust on there. And the third one is trust in the session. So we talk about this very much as behavioural or transaction risking. So is Ash behaving like Ash normally does in a service, or, you know, is he logging in Manchester and 3 minutes later logging in London? So all of that really good analytical stuff adds an extra layer of trust. Those things together, so really looking at our services in terms of what are people trying to do and what is the level of assurance that's needed for those services, and then looking at and how do we make the best use of the data and attributes that we have and things that we can do and orchestrate for our customers in order to build that level of trust before we pay benefits. Then that almost is our entire approach to inclusivity. And just to say, for DWP, our legislation is very clear. So before we pay benefits, we have to be at a position where it's probable that it is, and that's a medium confidence level for all of our services that pay benefits. Where we've moved from is you don't have to do that right at the very beginning. You can use the service and the actions that the customer's taking before you get to payment. So almost that high hurdle becomes an actual set of much smaller hurdles that are easier to get over, and we can help our customers. We can more easily see where they're dropping out and where they're struggling in the process. So I hope that answers the question, but I think the trust in the person, action and session has been a bit of a game changer for DWP, and it is something that we're feeding into the One Login program. All of that rich data that we've got, we share readily, not just with GDS, but with other departments as well.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Cheryl. I think it's getting a fine balance, isn't it, between customer experience and lack of friction and security and managing the risk, which is difficult. Ash, I can see you've raised a hand.
Yeah, I was just going to add a couple of things to Cheryl's really excellent summary. And as she said, we're learning a tremendous amount from the work that she is doing with her cohort of universal credit customers in particular. I just add a couple of things. I mean, ministers obviously really care about this. I mean, unlike this is probably a slightly unfair characterization, but unlike in the private sector, where there's a degree of choice about which customers to take on board and which not to, obviously we've got a legal, and you might even say moral, requirement to provide a service that does try to work genuinely for everyone. And ministers have been very clear to me, to GDS, that they want our new system to be more effective from an inclusivity and accessibility point of view than Verify has been. And so we're doing quite a lot of work across government to look at what other government-held data sources are out there that might help us with this. So as you'll know, Verify currently largely relies from a government-held data point of view on passports and driving licenses. There's a lot of other information out there that at least currently we're not making as much use of as we might. And we're doing some work with the Home Office, for instance, on the digitization of its General Register Office data, births, deaths and marriages data, which can help to fill in the gaps and build up that picture of who an individual might be. And there are other sources as well that we're exploring. And from there flows the obvious conclusion that we need to do better at being able to check those data sources across government than we currently sometimes are able to do due to legal or legislative constraints. So one of the things we're doing in parallel with the more technical side of our work is really starting to explore what we can do to make the legislative framework more robust, to give us the sort of more permissive data checking that can help with that inclusivity problem in particular, whilst of course having the right kind of safeguards in place to make sure that it isn't cutting across privacy and other requirements.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Ash. Mike, if I can just come back to yourself. So one of the interesting fundamentals, I guess, of the Scottish Government's approach to digital identity is to generate interest, to get other public sector organisations onboarded to using the service. Can you talk us through how you're approaching this partnership model and what the strategy is for other departments being part of that wider ecosystem in Scotland?
Yeah, absolutely, Nick. Thanks for the question. I think the key thing to bear in mind here is that digital identity isn't a service. It's not a service in itself. Getting a digital ID gets you nothing. And I've often said this, but no one wakes up in the morning and thinks the thing I need to do today is get a digital ID. It's merely a means to an entirely different end. And in the same way, no public services wake up in the morning, if that's a thing possibly, and think the thing we need to improve about our service today is how we identify our users. There are 1,000,001 other things more important to them. Now, COVID has shifted that slightly with far more new, let's call them customers, turning up in online channels where many services just don't have confident ways to assure those individuals. So yes, as well as developing a service, a key part of what we need to do is to articulate what the value of that service is, both to individuals and to other public services. Now, for individuals, it's slightly easier. It's reducing friction, it's reducing risk of identity fraud and identity theft, and it's reducing effort in accessing services, remembering multiple passwords, proving the same facts multiple times. You know, those things are obvious and easy to explain. For services, it's slightly more difficult, especially for public services. And why do I say that? Well, if you're a private sector company, and you know this is very much echoing what Ash has just said, if you're a private sector company with many competitors where you charge for a service, then there are particular things that you worry about. You worry about the onboarding costs of new customers. You worry about how much churn there is of your customers and how you minimize that through good service and trying to get your customer retention rates up. You worry about minimizing costs to keep you competitive and profitable. But in the public sector, you're the only provider of the service. So people will put up with more as there's nowhere else to empty your bin or pay you a benefit. And I think that this can make us lazy, because we don't get the failure rates. We don't get the customers going elsewhere because they can't. So we need to have a clearer focus on how we provide high quality, user-focused, efficient public services, and digital identity is going to be a large catalyst for that. So I think we're in a good place. I think that we have a good product. But yes, it's not just about developing a good product. It's about working with the other products that people are actually interested in, because users are interested in getting a benefit. They're interested in finding out whether their bin's been collected. They're interested in getting a disclosure check. They're not interested in a digital identity. So you have to, and I apologize to Microsoft Clippy, because I have kind of stolen that idea a lot in the way that we regard ourselves in a service. When you're accessing a service, we like to pop up and go, it looks like you're trying to identify yourself. Maybe we can help with that. And that really has to be the way that we introduce the concepts of identity and attributes and being able to bring facts about yourself to other services, and sell it through easy reuse. So one of the concepts that we've got, we're very firmly supportive of is, and I've always called it dynamic consent, but I've started to change the terminology and call it dynamic permission, because consent has very legalistic meanings that just gets us into difficult areas. But dynamic permission, so making sure that an individual is present when information about them moves. And this is where I have a slight issue potentially with some of the way that we're talking about data sharing. So checking government data sources, it's individuals' data. So why don't we sign it and give it to them? And make that the way that we share data between different departments. So there are different ways of doing this. So let's not, as people have said already, let's not try to recreate the way that we have done things in an analog way in a digital form. We need to try and think about things in a rather different way. And perhaps, as services, we all have to accept a part in the ecosystem, and that's the thing that we're trying to get across to all of the Scottish public sector bodies. You are already doing this work. You are verifying that someone is over 18. You are verifying that someone is in receipt of a benefit. You are verifying who knows what else. Someone else is interested in that. So why don't we give that value to the individual and allow them to benefit from that? And that's not an easy sell, because it involves all parts, all actors in the ecosystem having to do work. And it's not necessarily obvious to them immediately what the value is in that work. So it's a hard sell, but it's one that we're trying to get over that hump as we go. Yeah. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Mike. Probably last question. I can see we've got lots of questions in the Q&A, which we'll come on to. So final question as part of this panel. So Ash, the UK government has published the draft UK Digital Identity and Attributes Trust Framework fairly recently, which details new rules about identity and how people can verify their identity online. Can you provide more details about the framework, some of the key concepts, and what we may expect to see being brought into new digital identity services in the future?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. You'll know that my colleagues in DCMS lead on the trust framework, but I'll say a few words on their behalfs and apologise to them later if I go too far. But yes, I mean, this is really, as we've touched on already, is about recognising the benefit of these kinds of services and products. And I really agree with Mike about the challenges of describing these digital identity things as a discrete and abstract system or service or solution, when really they are a means to an end. They're an enabler of something else. And GDS, I think our current approach anyway is to be very clear about that, so that we are enabling the likes of Cheryl to deliver a service hopefully more effectively. We're not delivering a service ourselves as such, and I think there's a really important distinction there. But anyway, it's true that the sort of benefits we've been talking about also apply in the private sector, whether that's opening a bank account or traveling or whatever else it might be, and making sure that those kinds of products are robust and standards based and so on, is extremely important. Oh, my computer's frozen. It's a bit annoying. Bear with me 1 minute. I'm about to be cut off.
So Nick, whilst we're waiting for Ash, just to sort of build on what he was saying about the trust framework. So again, you know, we talked. I keep saying the words game changer, and actually, I think for me, the last 18 months have been the most exciting in digital identity, in terms of the new way people are thinking about it. So picking up on Mike's point, you know, about permissions, absolutely, you know, personal data stores, all of that kind of really good stuff has started to come to the fore. What we didn't have before was a framework to help us do that. So the trust framework, for me, is it's almost the holy grail that departments like myself can go to, in the knowledge that we can still provide our proportionate service that helps all of our customers, but actually it's a trusted framework of people who we can work with. The legwork that will save, particularly in departments the size of ours, will be phenomenal. And I think we often underplay the trust framework as something that, you know, is about gathering attributes together. I think as we get further down the path and it's better understood, we will really start to understand just how critical it is in terms of that future of digital identity.
Brilliant. Thanks, Cheryl.
Great filling, Cheryl. Thank you.
Yeah, fantastic filling.
It's always slightly embarrassing when somebody from the government digital service, his laptop decides to try and install a security patch during an actual presentation, doesn't it? Anyway, yes, I think that's a really good high-level summary, and the same also applies across the private sector to a large degree anyway. So you have that confidence as a customer that the service that you're using, the way you're interacting, the information you're sharing is all being done to a certain set of agreed standards, and that's all part of supporting the growth of economic growth, obviously, over the next few years. You mentioned, I think, Nick, but DCMS published a so-called alpha of its trust framework back in February. And really, this is the set of rules and standards which organizations agree to follow. And it gives you that kind of kite mark that if they are signed up to the framework, then you've got that sort of confidence and trust in them. It includes requirements in areas such as how best to create and use identities, if we can call them that in a discrete way, how organizations should handle and protect personal data, security and encryption, management of user accounts, protecting against fraud and misuse, and indeed on inclusivity, which we've touched on a lot of times. We have received a lot of feedback, really positive feedback and constructive feedback to the version that was sent out in February, and DCMS will be publishing the next iteration pretty soon, which will include a bit more on the certification process for organizations, how they demonstrate that they're meeting the requirements, amongst other things. So that next iteration will come out this summer. And then beyond that, the wider plans in this space and the linked up plans here are including a consultation on DCMS's digital identity legislation, which includes what governing body will own and manage the trust framework to make sure that we embed that those approaches and that confidence. So that's a flavour of what's to follow.
Fantastic, thanks, Ash. Well, I just want to say personally a huge thanks, guys, for that. That was really, really open and really interesting conversation. So I can see we're getting a lot of questions, actually 16 open questions. So Claire, can I just hand back to you for the Q&A, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all so much. And like you say, there's so many questions coming through at the moment. Some of them are along the same line, so I'll try and consolidate some of them. I've got one here that says, we're looking at moving from a corporate login for charities to an individual login for all charity trustees. I'd be interested to understand how the new one login for government proposes to deal with verifying identity of non-UK nationals, i.e. overseas trustees and directors and corporate trustee directors. And that's a question that, that there's many about this, about verifying non-UK nationals. Who would like to take that?
Yeah, I can start on that. I mean, I've been following the Q&A as well. And as you say, there are several here around the sort of scope of one login and what do we really mean by all services. We've deliberately said all services and everyone to make that vision as bold as it can be, but clearly we're not going to be able to deliver for all services across all bits of government and the public sector at the same time. So our focus over the next couple of years is going to be getting through the private beta, and then with an initial focus on, I would describe as central government services. But we are already talking to Mike and the other devolved administrations. We are already talking to local government representatives, for example, about their requirements in the slightly longer term. And over the course of this year, we will be doing some discovery work, joint discovery work, with NHS Digital and NHS more generally, and with BEIS, for example, on the questions of health and NHS interoperability and business identity as well. So those things are all definitely within the scope. And that includes also talking to the Home Office and others about the EU settlement scheme, which obviously has important attributes about individuals in the UK that are accessing services, and how we might become more interoperable with that system in the medium term as well. So I can't say today, obviously, where exactly all of those things fall on our roadmap, which is still very much under development, but certainly within the scope of work for this year to work out so how that might all fit together, how the roadmaps align, and to make sure we do the right kind of exploratory work, and is certainly within the wider and longer term scope. I see too one other thing on scope, which is about delegated access and third parties. I could have added that to my list of lessons to be learned from Verify, in that Verify doesn't currently allow delegated approaches. That is certainly something we are planning to fix on the one login system, and we're already doing some work with Cheryl and other departments on that exact question.
Great, I've got another one for you here. Somebody said, would it be better if there was a dedicated centralised government department to build the National Identity Service and also be a custodian of the personal data?
Can I answer this, but in capitals, and say no, please no. All the way through developing the solution that we've got in Scotland, the thing that has always been in the back of my mind is, what is the thing that is going to end up on the front page of and in Scotland it's Daily Record. In the UK it would no doubt be Daily Mail. And we have to, this is the very first thing that I said in this whole event was, it has a checkered past. Digital identity has a checkered past, and we have to bear that in mind. Anything that looks remotely like a national identity database or a national identity card will fail. It will fail in this country. So we need to always have that in the back of our mind and make sure that we are doing things that are user-based, that are enabling users to manage their data and get the value from their data. Anything that looks remotely like a national store of data or a national way of checking data will immediately be met by suspicion. So please no.
Yeah,
that's my answer. I don't know whether Ash and Cheryl would agree.
Yeah, I agree with much of that. We'd have to, and are treading very carefully on all of those issues. GDS is that central convening, driving function, and I'm hoping that some of you will have seen Tom Reed, our new chief executives or newest chief executives, latest and updated strategy for GDS, which I think gives a good flavour of how we think we can best add real value where it's necessary at the centre of government. But those issues that Mike mentioned are knotty ones, and we do need to keep treading carefully on them.
Great stuff. We've got another one here, I think for you, Mike, that says, is there any planned crossover between DIS and DI to remove frustration for Scottish users who need to use the services that don't fall into the remit of the Scottish Government?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, I did talk earlier about convergence. That a year, 18 months ago, there was definitely a feeling that there was a divergence of approaches between Scotland and UK. I think that has changed, and that there's much more of a convergence now in terms of that we're both looking at one login. We need to have those meetings, and we've got one next Monday, I think, Ash, to talk about how do we make it at least interoperable, or do we go further in trying to make sure that that there is only one login required. But I think we need to be careful, because it needs to be user-led. And for example, one of the rounds of user testing that we've done recently, it was a small sample. We need to redo it, but we asked users explain to them what one login would mean and what it would look like, and we asked them, what services would you expect to be able to use with this? And gave them a wide range of potential Scottish services, UK services, and private sector services. And people were very clear about the difference between Scottish Government and UK Government, and by and large didn't expect a Scottish login to give them access to UK Government service. Now, maybe once we've got something up and running and they then find that it's easy to use, that it's simple, that might well change. That they may well think, well, if I've got this simple login, why can't I use it for UK Government services? But we need to be careful about assuming what people want and how people want to be able to use it. And for example, nobody wanted or expected to be able to use their government login for a private sector service in that small sample. So again, it's something we need to do more work on, but we need to make sure that we're not making assumptions about what people want.
Great, and you've touched on something there that I think all the panel can maybe elaborate a bit more on. So we've talked about one login for government. Taking this a step further, can the panel share their thoughts on whether we might see a future in which a citizen has one digital ID for accessing all services across government and private sector services? Cheryl, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, sure. So I think what I can see a world is where citizens have control of their own data and their own attributes that would make up their digital identity. So I think digital identity as a thing is evolving to be something different. So my digital identity will be different to Mike's, will be different to Ash's, because it will be based on different data and different attributes. And I think that's absolutely right. So we've talked a lot about inclusivity, proportionality, being able to say one digital identity was verify, to be truthful. And actually we've evolved beyond that to say there are many different ways to get to the outcome. And it's about orchestrating those many different ways and giving the citizen as much control as possible over that attributes and orchestration. So yes, I definitely see a world. I'm trying to avoid the use of the word wallet, but I definitely do see a world where those who can control their own identity should be able to, their own attributes, but there will always be people who will need help to do that. And I think as long as we do those two things together, then absolutely I can see that world.
Great, unless Mike or Ash wants to add anything there. I've got a question for you here around the role that local government has to play in this. One of the attendees is saying that whilst they were a contributor to verify for local government, it obviously fell a little by the wayside. Who would like to talk about that?
Yeah, I can say a few words about that. I mean, I really agree. I mean, a lot of people's sort of day-to-day involvement with public sector services or government services are actually local things, not central things. And yet the attention, in some ways, understandably, is on those more central, bigger life event type of services rather than the day-to-day. So, as I said earlier, I'm really keen that our long-term roadmap for what we're now doing encompasses those local services. It's another order of magnitude of complexity, the many hundred of authorities across the UK as a whole. But some of those are already well advanced and have good online systems already in place, others less so. So as I said, we are talking to a good number of local authorities and local government associations, and I'm going to ramp that up over the next few months, but probably in reality, as far as the user is concerned, one for the medium term rather than the next year or two, I think it's realistic to say.
And Mike, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, it was just to add that I think we see local government as a potentially key partner in the identity verification part of the problem, because as Ash said, the majority of services that you interact with on a regular basis are local government ones. Now, we should be able to use that regular interaction to verify the identity of someone who struggles to get through the traditional identity verification route through passport or through driving license, or just through inability to interact with digital services. We should be trying to make sure that interactions that happen with the public sector, wherever they happen, provide further data, provide further assurance of an individual, and be able to use that wherever that individual needs them. So yes, whether that's placing it in a wallet or whether it's putting it somewhere else, who cares where it goes, to be frank, but it's making it available so that the value that interaction has created is made available to the individual.
That sounds great, and I think that's a great point for us to bring the discussion to a close. So all I would like to say is thank you so much to you, Mike, Cheryl, Ash, for taking the time to do this today. There were far more questions than we could have ever had time to get to, but it just shows the level of interest in this topic. And thank you to you too, Nick, for facilitating the panel today. And thank you to everybody for joining. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the sessions as part of Digital Leaders Week. And enjoy the rest of your day. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.